Discourse on the Method for Conducting One's Reason Well, etc., etc., Part 2, by Rene Descartes. I was then in Germany, where the occasion of the wars, which are not yet over there, had called me, and I was returning to the army from the coronation of the Emperor. The onset of winter detained me in quarters where, finding no conversation to divert me, and fortunately having no worries or passions to trouble me, I remained for an entire day shut up by myself in a stove-heated room, where I was completely free to converse with myself about my thoughts. Among them, one of the first was that it occurred to me to consider that there is often not so much perfection in works composed of many pieces, and made by the hands of various master craftsmen, as there is in those works on which but a single individual has worked. Thus, one sees that buildings undertaken and completed by a single architect are usually more attractive and better ordered than those which many architects have tried to patch up by using old walls that had been built for other purposes. Thus, those ancient cities that were once mere villages, and in the course of time have become large towns, are usually so poorly laid out compared to those well-ordered places that an engineer traces out on vacant plains as it suits his fancy, that even though, upon considering each building one by one in the former sort, one often finds as much, if not more, art than one finds in those of the latter sort, still, upon seeing how the buildings are arranged, here a large one, there a small one, how they make the streets crooked and uneven, one would say that it is chance rather than the will of some men using reason that has arranged them thus. And if one considers that there have nevertheless always been officials responsible for seeing that private buildings contribute to the attractiveness of public areas, one will well understand that it is difficult to make things that are very finely crafted by laboring only on the works of others. Thus I imagine that peoples who, having once been half savages and having been civilized only little by little, having made their laws only to the extent that the inconvenience due to crimes and quarrels have forced them to do, could not be as well ordered as those who, from the very beginning of their coming together, have followed the fundamental precepts of some prudent legislator. Likewise, it is quite certain that the state of the true religion, whose ordinances were made by God alone, must incomparably be better ordered than the others. And, speaking of things human, I believe that if Sparta was at one time very flourishing, this was not because of the goodness of each one of its laws taken by itself, seeing that many of them were very strange and even contrary to good morals, but because, having been devised by one individual, they all tended towards the same end. And thus I thought that book learning, at least the kind whose reasonings are merely probable and that do not have any demonstrations, have been composed and enlarged little by little from the opinions of many different people, does not draw nearly so close to the truth as the simple reasonings that a man of good sense can naturally make about the things he encounters. And thus, too, I thought that, because we are all children before being men, and because for a long time it was necessary for us to be governed by our appetites and our teachers, which were frequently in conflict with one another, and of which perhaps neither always gave us the best advice, it is nearly impossible for our judgments to be as pure or as solid as they would have been if we had had the full use of our reason from the moment of our birth, and if we had always been guided by reason alone. It is true that we never see anyone pulling down all the houses in a city, for the sole purpose of rebuilding them in a different style, and of making the streets more attractive. But one does see very well that many people tear down their own houses in order to rebuild them, and that in some cases they are even forced to do so when their houses are in danger of collapsing and when the foundations are not very secure. This example persuaded me that it would not really be at all reasonable for a single individual to plan to reform a state by changing everything in it from the foundations up, and by toppling it in order to set it up again, nor even able to also to reform the body of the sciences or the order established in the schools for teaching them, but that, as regards all the opinions to which I had until now given credit, I could not do better than to try to get rid of them once and for all, in order to replace them later on, either with ones that are better, or even with the same ones I had reconciled them to the norms of reason. And I firmly believed that, by this means I would succeed in conducting my life much better than if I were to build only upon old foundations, and if I were to rely only on the principles of which I had allowed myself to be persuaded in my youth, without ever actually examining whether they were true. For although I noticed various difficulties in this undertaking, still they were not irremediable, nor were they comparable to those difficulties occurring in the reform of the least things that affect the public. These great bodies are too difficult to raise up once they have been knocked down, or even to hold up once they have been shaken, and their fall can only be very violent. Moreover, as to their imperfections, if they have any, and the mere fact of the diversity that exists among them suffices to assure one that many do have imperfections, customs have doubtless greatly mitigated them, and have even prevented or imperceptibly corrected many of them, against which prudence could not provide so well. And finally, these imperfections are almost always more tolerable than changing them would be. Similarly, the great roads that wind through mountains little by little become so smooth and so convenient by dint of being frequently used, that it is much better to follow them than to try to take a more direct route by climbing over rocks and descending to the bottom of canyons. That is why I could in no way approve of those trouble-making and restless personalities who, called neither by their birth nor by their fortune to manage public affairs, are forever coming up with an idea for some new reform in this matter. And if I thought there were in this writing the slightest thing by means of which one might suspect me of folly, I would be very sorry to permit its publication. My plan has never gone beyond trying to reform my own thoughts, and building upon a foundation which is completely my own. And if, my work having pleased me sufficiently, I here show you a model of it, it is not for the reason that I would wish you to advise anyone to imitate it. Perhaps those with whom God has better shared his graces will have more lofty plans, but I fear that even the one I have already set for myself here may already be too daring for many. The single resolution to rid oneself of all the opinions to which one has to heretofore given credence is not an example that everyone ought to follow, and the world consists almost exclusively of two kinds of minds for whom it is not at all suitable. First, there are those who, believing themselves more capable than they are unable to avoid being hasty in their judgments, or to have enough patience to conduct all their thoughts in an orderly manner. As a result, if they have once taken the liberty of doubting the principles they had accepted and of straying from the common path, they could never keep to the path one must take in order to go in a more straightforward direction, and they would remain lost all their lives. Second, there are those who have enough reason or modesty to judge that they are less capable of distinguishing the true from the false than certain others by whom they can be instructed. They should content themselves more with following the opinions of these others than with looking for better ones themselves. And as for myself, I would unquestionably have been counted among these latter persons, if I had always had only one master, or if I had not known at all the differences that have always existed among the opinions of the most learned. But I had learned in my college days that one cannot imagine anything so strange or so little believable that it had not been said by any one of the philosophers, and since then, I had recognized in my travels that all those who have sentiments quite contrary to our own are not for that reason barbarians or savages, but that many of them use their reason as much as or more than we do. And I considered how one and the same man with the very same mind, were he brought up from infancy among the French or the Germans, would become different from what he would be had he always lived among the Chinese or the cannibals, and how, even down to the styles of our clothing, the same thing that pleased us 10 years ago, and that perhaps will please us again 10 years hence, now seems to us extravagant and ridiculous. Thus it is more custom and example that persuades us than any certain knowledge, and yet the majority opinion is worthless as a proof of truths that are at all difficult to discover, since it is much more likely that one man would have found them than a whole multitude of people. Hence I could not choose any one whose opinions seemed to me should be preferred over those of others, and I found myself, as it were, constrained to try to guide myself on my own. But, like a man who walks alone and in the dark, I resolved to go so slowly, and to use so much circumspection in all things that, if I had advanced only very slightly, at least I would effectively keep myself from falling. Nor did I want to begin to reject totally any of the opinions that had once been able to slip into my head, without having been introduced there by reason, until I had first spent sufficient time planning the work I was undertaking, and seeking the true method for arriving at the knowledge of everything of which my mind would be capable. When I was younger, I had studied, among the parts of philosophy, a little logic, and among those of mathematics, a bit of geometrical analysis and algebra, 3 arts or sciences that, it seemed, ought to contribute something to my plan. But in examining them, I noticed that, in the case of logic, its syllogisms and the greater part of its other lessons served more to explain someone else the things one knows, or even, like the art of lowly, to speak without judgment concerning matters about which one is ignorant, than to learn them. And although, in effect, it might well contain many very true and very good precepts, nevertheless there are so many others mixed up with them that are either harmful or superfluous, that it is almost as difficult to separate the latter precepts from the former as it is to draw a Diana or a Minerva from a block of marble that has not yet been honed. Then, as to the analysis of the ancient and the algebra of the moderns, apart from the fact that they apply only to very abstract matters and seem to be of no use, the former is always so closely tied to the consideration of figures that it cannot exercise understanding without greatly fatiguing the imagination. In the case of the latter, that is algebra, one is so subjected to certain rules and to certain symbols that out of it there results a confused and obscure art that encumbers the mind, rather than a science that cultivates it. That is why I thought it necessary to search for some other method of embracing the advantages of these 3, yet free from their defects. And since the multiplicity of laws often provides excuses for vices, so that a state is much better ruled when it has but very few laws, and when these are very strictly observed. Likewise, in place of the large number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believe that the following 4 rules would be sufficient for me, provided I made a firm and constant resolution not even once to fail to observe them. The first was never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such, that is to say, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice, and to include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and so distinctly that I had no occasion to call it in doubt. The second is to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parts as possible, and as was required in order to better resolve them. The third, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion, by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know, in order to ascend them little by little, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things, and by supposing an order even among those things that do not naturally precede one another. And the last, everywhere to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I was assured of having omitted nothing. Those long chains of utterly simple and easy reasonings that geometers commonly use to arrive at their most difficult demonstrations had given me occasion to imagine that all things that could fall within human knowledge follow from one another in the same way, and that, provided only that one abstains from accepting any of them as true that is not true, and that one always adheres to the order one must follow in deducing the ones from the other things, there cannot be any that are so remote that they are not eventually reached, nor so hidden that they are not discovered. And I was not very worried about trying to find out which of them it would be necessary to begin with, for I already knew that it was with the simplest and easiest to know. And considering that, of all those who have hitherto searched for the truth in the sciences, only mathematicians have been able to find any demonstrations, that is to say, certain and evident reasonings, I did not at all doubt that it was with these same things that they had examined that I should begin, although I expected from them no other utility but that they would accustom my mind to nourish itself on truths, and not to be content with false reasonings. But it was not my plan on that account to try to learn all those particular sciences commonly called mathematical, and seeing that, even though their objects differed, These sciences did not cease to be all in accord with one another in considering nothing but the various relations or proportions which are found in their objects. I thought it would be more worthwhile for me to examine only these proportions in general, and to suppose them to be only in subjects that would help me make the knowledge of them easier, and without at the same time in any way restricting them to those subjects, so that later I could apply them all the better to everything else to which they might pertain. Then, having noted that, in order to know these proportions, I would sometimes need to consider each of them individually, and sometimes only to keep them in mind, or to grasp many of them together. I thought that, in order better to consider them in particular, I ought to suppose them to be relations between the lines, since I found nothing more simple, or nothing that I could represent more distinctly to my imagination and to my senses, but that, in order to keep them in mind or to grasp many of them together, I would have to explicate them by means of certain symbols, the briefest ones possible, and that by this means I would be borrowing all that is best in geometrical analysis and algebra, and correcting all the defects of the one by means of the other. In fact, I dare say the strict adherence to these few rules I had chosen gave me such facility for disentangling all the questions to which these two sciences extend that, in the 2 or 3 months I spent examining them, having begun with the simple and most general, and each truth that I found being a rule that later helped me to find others, not only did I arrive at a solution of many problems that I had previously judged very difficult, but it also seemed to me toward the end that, even in those instances where I was ignorant, I could determine by what means and how far it was possible to resolve them. In this, perhaps, I shall not seem to you to be too vain, if you will consider that, there being but one truth with respect to each thing, whoever finds this knowledge knows as much about a thing as can be known, and that, for example, if a child who has been instructed in arithmetic has made an addition following its rules, he can be assured of having found everything regarding the sum he was examining that the human mind would know how to find. For, ultimately, the method that teaches one to follow the true order and to enumerate exactly all the circumstances of what one is seeking contains everything that gives certainty to the rules of arithmetic. But what pleased me most about this method was that by means of it I was assured of using my reason in everything, if not perfectly, at least as well was in my power. And in addition that I felt that in practicing this method my mind was little by little getting in the habit of conceiving its objects more rigorously and more distinctly, and that, not having restricted the method to any particular subject matter, I promised myself to apply it as usefully to the problems of the other sciences as I had to those of algebra. Not that, on this account, I would have dared at the outset to undertake an examination of all the problems that presented themselves, for that would itself have been contrary to the order prescribed by the method. But, having noted that the principles of these sciences must all be derived from philosophy, in which I did not yet find any that were certain, I thought that it was necessary for me, first of all, to try to establish some there, and that, this being the most important thing in the world, and the thing in which hasty judgment and prejudice were most to be feared, I should not try to accomplish that objective until I had reached a much more mature age than that of barely 23, which I was then, and until I had first spent a great deal of time preparing myself for it, as much in rooting out from my mind all the wrong opinions that I had accepted before that time as in accumulating many experiences, in order for them later to be the subject matter of my reasonings, and in always practicing the method I had prescribed for myself so as to strengthen myself more and more in its use. End of Part 2.